Growing up, I went to Jewish day schools, which are similar to Catholic schools in that learning takes place within the context of a particular theological framework. But it also meant that in addition to the general Ontario curriculum, I had other core courses which included Hebrew Bible, Jewish law, and Hebrew language and literature. So it was a very full day, as you can imagine. But in addition to going to Jewish schools, I also grew up in a particularly Jewish suburb of Toronto. So that meant that any of the extracurricular activities that I was going to be involved in were most likely going to involve other Jews. As a result, before I was 18 years old, before I became friends with people who weren't Jewish. Now, I know that sounds really crazy, given how multicultural a city the GTA is, but I imagine that this could still be the case for very many young people today. Because this is a city of neighborhoods, and one's world until a certain age is very much limited to the neighborhood that one grows up in, it may not be until someone goes on to university or enters the workplace for the first time that they begin to become well acquainted with people outside of their very familiar ethnocultural and religious groups. In my case, the strange irony is that the first time I became friends with people who weren't Jewish was when I moved to Israel. Having grown up in a pretty homogeneous environment, I really craved difference. So when I arrived in Jerusalem on a year abroad program in 1993, dating me a little bit, I went out of my way to make the place my personal playground. While I naturally learned more about Judaism while I was there and improved my Hebrew, I also began studying Islam and learning Arabic, premised on the idea that if I was going to live there, it was important to be able to speak to my neighbors in their own languages. I took the opportunity to visit many different synagogues and Jewish communities, but also churches, mosques, and Arab communities. I traveled to Egypt and Jordan, took courses on the history of the Palestinians, made trips to Bethlehem on Christmas Eve, took Arab buses and taxis, and walked through Arab East Jerusalem as often as I could. It was as if I was going through a mental list, and one by one, intentionally exposing myself to people and things I had been told were suspect throughout my childhood. When I returned to Toronto, I was determined to continue these new learning opportunities that I had started in Jerusalem. I tried in vain to start a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group at York University in 1994. I laugh now at how naive I was, but I was young and I had no resources. So I turned to established organizations like the Jewish and Arab Student Federations at York University to help me get the project off the ground. But interest was very minimal. They just weren't ready for this kind of thing. I put that, no?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Can I come back? Yeah?
No?
I can try to talk
just very loudly. No? Okay. Okay. I put that project on hold for a few years, engaging with it once again in Jerusalem when I did my master's degree. I got involved in a few activist projects involving Jews and Palestinians, including a tutoring program for Palestinian children. And I soon discovered that the progressive, modern Orthodox synagogue near my apartment, which served mostly an Anglo-American immigrant population, was hosting a program called Beit Midrash Madrasa, which means house of study in both Hebrew and in Arabic. One evening, the chief rabbi of Haifa spoke on a panel together with the Sufi sheikh. But on another occasion, maybe I'll just try to talk really loudly without the microphone. Is everybody okay with that? It's just buzzing a little bit. So
What you're hearing is feedback because they turn the microphone up, and then as the microphone hears itself, there's a feedback, and that's the sound. If you speak really close to the microphone, you'll have the opposite thing happen.
Okay. Yeah?
I think so.
Okay. All right. One evening, the chief rabbi of Haifa spoke on a panel together with the Sufi sheikh. But on another occasion, the synagogue convened a panel of Jewish and Muslim women speaking about issues of mutual concern in Judaism and Islam. I was riveted, and I was determined to figure out a way to contribute to such a valuable conversation. I made inquiries among people I trusted about how to bring Jewish and Muslim women together in Jerusalem to study classical texts. but the political obstacles were far too great. Where would we meet? Would the Muslim women be from East Jerusalem or from the West Bank? If the latter, what about getting through checkpoints? If the former, would the women need to be accompanied by men? What if there were curfews in effect? If we met in East Jerusalem, would the Jewish women even come? And all of those complications that I was dealing with back then, in about the year 98 to 99, would be multiplied now. But I was very, at the time, frustrated even by the very few political realities that I was dealing with. So, again, I put the project on hold. Upon returning to Toronto again, this time in 1998, I was pleased to discover that someone else had started a Palestinian Jewish dialogue group and that it was active. I joined immediately, but I found it infinitely frustrating for a variety of reasons. To my mind, this type of cross-cultural exchange had several flaws. First of all, the only thing that all the people in the room had in common was conflict. That to me seemed like a really bad place to start. If two people were going out on a date and they immediately discovered that they had very, very different political views on things, the conversation probably wouldn't be able to progress for them to discover that they both really love dogs and they are both vegetarian and that they volunteered for Greenpeace 10 years ago. So starting from a place of conflict is usually a very problematic position to begin with. The other thing that I found was that even though there were lots of women in these groups who had very strong opinions about what was being discussed, the conversation tended to be dominated by two very strong male voices. In one instance, I remember two men ping-ponging back and forth, almost screaming at each other. Even though they were really well-intentioned and were coming from a place of interest, wanting to hear one another, the conversation always degenerated into a screaming match. It also had people constantly talking past one another. Many of the Jewish participants were interested in speaking about historical Jewish trauma, while Palestinian participants were interested in speaking about the facts on the ground and how to lobby governments to force the Israelis to leave the occupied West Bank and Gaza. So the conversations were never, no one was listening to one another. People weren't hearing what one another was saying. Which was also very frustrating. Again, these are well-intentioned people who want to engage with one another, and yet people weren't able to progress and move forward. The other issue that I found was that a lot of the people involved in these groups tended to see the Mideast conflict as having religious roots, rather than seeing it as a geopolitical conflict. So spirituality and religious engagement was really marginalized. So much so that a lot of the meetings often occurred when I, who is someone who has deep spiritual commitments to my own Judaism, meetings occurred when I was expected to be home having a Sabbath dinner with my family. On one occasion when they decided to hold an Abrahamic peace seder, which brought together Jewish, Muslim, and Christian participants to explore the healing relationship between the children of Abraham that was modeled on a traditional Passover meal. It took place during the holiday of Passover, and of course none of the food that was provided was something that I was able to eat because I was keeping the dietary restrictions of Passover quite closely. So while it was a Passover Seder, someone who was keeping Passover was not able to eat. So I found that these three things, the fact that it was based in conflict, the fact that very often women had no place at the table, and the fact that there was no room for any sort of spiritual engagement, made this kind of dialogue very, very frustrating and dissatisfying for me in particular. So because I was frustrated with this, I decided once again that maybe this was time to bring up my notion of bringing Jewish and Muslim women together over religious text. So we have to go back to the time and place when I was beginning to start this initiative. So it was 2003. And in the post-9/11 universe, the conversations in the mainstream were about hijab, or the veil in Islam, and how Islam was oppressive to women. But there was very little public and nuanced discourse about Muslim women's full participation and inclusion in ritual and communal life. Within the Jewish community, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dominated the agenda, along with the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism emerging out of the Middle East. discussions of women's role and status in Judaism were not at the fore at all. While the more liberal denominations in Judaism in Toronto did have female rabbis serving their congregations, within Orthodox congregations, questions of women's ritual leadership were not on the table at all, and there were even restrictions on the number of women who could serve on boards and bylaws barring them from becoming senior officers. While the gender issues in Judaism had certainly not been resolved, there seemed to be little public discussion on these issues. So it was against this backdrop that I decided to convene a group of Jewish and Muslim women who could study religious texts together. Now, while some have contended that religious texts are the very source of divisiveness and conflict between faith communities, to my mind, they are the site where our religious, gendered, and political identities are formed. So they are precisely the best place to begin having nuanced conversations about who we are. I decided that religious texts would be a good place to start with women in particular, because I sensed that Jewish and Muslim women might have a similar sense of dislocation in relation to texts. The very sources that form the basis of our fundamental beliefs and practices often exclude women entirely or reduce their socio-legal, ritual, and leadership status. It occurred to me that this dissonance between lived experience and textual prohibitions could form a sort of kinship between Jewish and Muslim women. So through my personal networks, based on this hunch, I spread word about the project, and on the day of the first meeting, 20 women, 10 Jewish women and 10 Muslim women, showed up to my home, which was a small apartment at Dovercourt and Ossington, Dovercourt College, back then. Although subsequent meetings would never have such a large turnout, this convinced me that there was a great need for such an initiative in Toronto. Since then, I've moved from meeting in people's homes to convening classes and larger workshops in community-based settings. I've also begun using texts to explore environmental ethics as an issue galvanizing youth, and most recently I curated a Jewish-Muslim art show reflecting on the similar prohibitions around visual imagery that we have both in Judaism and Islam. And if you're interested in seeing that art exhibit, it's called Beyond Calligraphy, and right now it's actually being shown at Hart House in their Talking Walls exhibit, so a little plug there. While there are other ways that people can explore issues of faith, either through film, through books, through even cooking circles, I like using text for a variety of reasons, and I'll give you a variety of examples of what I'm about to talk about. The reason I like using texts is because they make the familiar seem strange, they make the strange seem familiar, and they accelerate the intimacy process in really surprising ways. So what do I mean by they make the familiar seem strange? So when I first started convening these groups, it always was really mind-boggling to me to how far from the prescribed topic we would often wander. And part of the reason for this was that in order to explain one concept, I usually had to back up and explain about 6 other concepts before we could even get to the topic that I had intended for us to discuss that day. One really interesting exchange involved a session where we were exploring marriage laws in Judaism and Islam. So I would usually divide the session. We'd have 2 hours, and the first hour would explore one faith tradition, and the second hour would explore the text in the other faith tradition. And we would look at, usually we would look at Torah and Quran, so both understood as being revealed scriptures, but then we'd also look at interpretive texts. So we'd look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are the first sort of legal layer of interpretation in Judaism. And then we'd look at Hadith, which are the prophetic traditions in Islam, which also serve the function of interpreting the Quran, and even some of the other legal texts in the Quran known as fiqh, or more broadly known as Sharia law, right? So I had to explain that marriage laws in Judaism derive not so much from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah, but from the Mishnah, which, as I explained, is that first legal layer that was compiled by rabbis around the 2nd century CE. So in order to explain what the Mishnah was, I had to go back to the landscape around 1st century CE in the land of Israel. And I began to explain that there were these 3 rival groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and suddenly the third group is blanking, the Essenes, thank you so much. So I was explaining that the Sadducees were represented the priestly class in Judaism. And I could see one of the Muslim women in the room was totally perplexed, and she's looking at me completely befuddled, and I asked her, I'm sorry, what's wrong? She said, I don't understand why you're talking about priests. I thought that in Judaism you had rabbis. So this, for me, was this really interesting moment where I had taken something completely for granted. So then we had to go back, and I had to explain about Moses and Aaron and the priestly families. So that was a really interesting moment for me, and sort of showed why some of these digressions that we had to go on, which would last a very long time over the course of the work we did, why these digressions were really important. So I never worried when we moved off topic, because I knew that through the course of moving off topic, people were learning from one another. On another occasion, we met over the Jewish holiday of Purim, which sort of commemorates the story in the book of Esther, which I'm sure many of you are well aware of. And I often describe it as being like the Jewish Halloween, because one of the traditions is the holiday celebrates reversals, and you're supposed to, one of the obligations associated with the holiday is that you're supposed to get intoxicated. And part of this is to celebrate the notion of, again, reversals in the story. And you're supposed to get intoxicated to the point where you don't know the difference between the blessed Mordecai, the hero of the story, and the evil Haman. So it was very, very uncomfortable having to try to explain this obligation of intoxication to a group of Muslim women. So again, Purim is always a holiday that I found to be particularly strange, but it became even more strange through the eyes of the Muslim women in the group. On the other hand, sometimes the studying of texts offers an occasion for what's strange to become familiar. And I had many of these experiences, especially when I was convening the Reading Abrahamic Scriptures group that involved both Muslims and Christians together with Jews. So a lot of the time I would be reading something either in the Quran or in the New Testament, and suddenly something would become so crystal clear to me that I found so fascinating that I could understand through the lens of my own tradition. So for example, in the Quran, in the second surah, or second chapter, there's a discussion about the holiday of Ramadan. And in this discussion, there's a directive that you're allowed to eat, you're allowed to break the fast in the evening, you're allowed to eat over the course of the night, until the white thread becomes distinct to you from the black thread. And so this instantly was very familiar to me because there is a passage in the Mishnah, again, the same text, the first interpretive layer in Judaism, that talks about when one can recite the Shema prayer. So the monotheistic creed in Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. There are set times when one is able to recite this prayer, recite twice a day, and so there's a discussion in the Mishnah that tries to determine at what point in the morning you can begin to say the morning prayer, and it talks about being able to distinguish between the white thread and the blue thread. And this is why men's prayer shawls, which you've probably seen that are usually often black and white, they traditionally used to have a turquoise thread, and it was for this purpose, so that you would know the timing of the morning prayer. So having that in my background, then suddenly being able to read this Quranic passage, and it made a world of sense to me in a way that was really interesting. So while this was not my own text, it suddenly, I sort of felt like a portal had been opened for me, that I could understand it in a new way. And similarly for my Muslim conference dialogue partners, it's also opened the text up in really fascinating ways, because this is not something that they had had access to before. So as we often say when those of us who do this kind of interfaith text study work, you often end up learning so much more about your own tradition than anybody else's, but there are these moments that open up the other tradition in a way that's really fascinating and really accessible too. Also, when I was reading the book of Romans 2:29, and Paul talks about the circumcision of the heart. That was really interesting for me because I had just been reading all sorts of texts in the book of Maccabees, which talked about the struggles that the Jews were having around circumcision in general, and how there were Jews that were attempting to reverse their circumcision. So this spoke to a sort of an idea that had already existed in the Jewish community for some time about the role of circumcision in the Jewish community, and what is it circumcision that makes somebody Jewish, or is it something else? Is it something in the heart or in one's practice that would identify a person as a Jew? So again, this sort of strange phrase, circumcision of the heart, really opened up a really interesting space for me and helped me continue to think through some of the other issues that I had been exploring in Jewish history. So that's one of the ways where the strange becomes familiar. But what's also really interesting is the way text can accelerate the intimacy process. I could probably go for coffee with someone for 2 hours and not necessarily learn all the things that I learned over the course of some of these text study sessions that we had. People, because they were sharing something that was important to them, it opened up a world and a space for people to speak of the differences between what they saw in their texts and how they lived out their reality. And oftentimes this was a lot of very personal information that people were sharing with us. We were looking at menstrual taboos in Judaism and Islam, and one of the women, the Jewish woman in the group, mentioned to us her experiences with observing family purity laws in Judaism. So this is where men and women separate from the onset of the woman's period for a 2-week period, and there's no physical intimacy between them at all until the woman goes to the mikveh, or the ritual bath. And so one of the participants actually went out of her way to talk to us about this very private experience and how it had really changed her entire relationship, not only with her spouse, but with Judaism in general, and how much this had deepened her own sense of spirituality. On the other hand, conversations around hijab and modesty practices in Islam were always very spirited conversations with various people understanding the texts in different ways. But one woman shared with us how growing up in Egypt, hijab had not at all been an issue. People didn't wear it, it wasn't commonplace. And she recounted one instance where a teacher of hers had been put on the spot by a male student who said, well, doesn't the text say such and shouldn't you be wearing one? And she started to apologize to the student, saying, you're right. So this really interesting power dynamic developed in the conversation in the class, which then prompted my friend to go home and start looking up the sources. And she began this whole journey of questioning what she had been receiving, and she eventually ended up becoming a professor of Islamic studies. So this was the one moment that sort of set her on her journey. So these were things that I may not have known, again, if I had just gone for coffee with someone, but it was the act of sharing something that is very personal and private. It's because we're sharing the texts, which are so central to our everyday practices, that sort of allowed for these kinds of opportunities and conversations to take hold. I think I'll end with a quote, actually. This quote is from one of my supervisors and mentors, Professor Robert Gibbs, and he's been involved with this kind of Jewish, Muslim, Christian engagement for some time. So this is his description of reading classical religious texts together. As we read the text, we're constantly surprised by the ways that the texts overlap and diverge. Each tradition negotiates with a complex problem in its own style. Indeed, perhaps the strongest aspect of this practice is a deep respect for the differences between the three traditions, and how communication is not only not prohibited because of these differences, but is actually enhanced by it. We learn more studying with each other, more about another tradition, but also more about our own. Justifying our own text to each other, we learn more about the internal dynamics of our own traditions.